Muslim apologists claim that Surah 25:53 is a miracle and is confirmed by marine science. Unfortunately, marine science completely disagrees with this verse. There is no forbidden partition between the water bodies. Moreover, if we grade this verse, it scores just 1 out of 6. In this video, I will provide all the scientific evidences, but first, let's hear about Surah 25:53 from the one and only.
In the field of oceanography, there's a verse in the Qur'an, in Surah Furqan, chapter number 25, verse number 53 says that He has let two bodies of flowing water, one sweet and palatable and the other salty and bitter. Though they meet, they do not mix. There is a barrier which is forbidden to be trespassed.
Pick any of your favorite translation and it will tell you essentially the same thing. Between sweet and salt water bodies, there is a forbidding ban or an inviolable obstruction or an insurmountable barrier or a banned barrier. The word-by-word morphology from the Corpus Qur'an's website also repeats the exact same thing. We will revisit this question again after I put forward the scientific evidences. Now, if Muslim apologists like Zakir Naik have already convinced you that this verse is a yet another scientific miracle in the Quran, then I must warn you that this video might change your mind. The great thing about this verse is that it is very clear and detailed and leaves absolutely no room for any confusion. As you can see, the barrier has been defined very rigorously. It could have stopped after the yellow segment, but it didn't. It went on to say that this barrier is a partition, and that too a forbidden partition. Now, these claims are extremely demanding. If this denotes the set of all kinds of barriers, then this tiny yellow circle denotes those barriers which also act as a forbidden partition. For example, this wall is a barrier which completely forbids the transmission of sound waves. But this wall with a small hole, although acts as a barrier to sound waves, is not really a forbidden partition. In this video, we will prove that between river and sea, there is no such barrier acting like a forbidden partition. Fresh and salt water mix, hence river and sea mix. A part of the river turns brackish by mixing with the sea. This part is known as an estuary. Estuaries exist, which proves that Surah 25:53 is wrong. Now, if Surah 25:53 is indeed true, then wherever a river meets the sea, only two kinds of situations are possible. The first would be a land partition or isthmus that completely separates a river from the sea, like this, which is what is mentioned in the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir. He says, a barrier, which means a partition, which is a dry land, and in brackets, and a complete partition means a barrier to prevent one of them from reaching the other. Additionally, Tafsir of Al-Jalalayn mentions the same thing. He talks about isthmus, which is just a land barrier, and he says that the one does not mix with the other, and a forbidding ban, a shield that prevents the two from becoming mixed. Tafsir of Ibn-Abbas does not particularly mention about a land barrier, but otherwise says the same thing as Ibn Kathir or Al-Jalalayn. He says, a barrier between the sweet and the salty, and in brackets, and a forbidding ban between them, preventing either one from transgressing against the other, such as to make the taste of either of them change. The second and the last possibility is a very sharp interface between the river and the sea, which does not allow any mixing, however hard you try, like that between oil and water. Since Surah 25:53 is a law decreed by the all-wise, all-knowing Allah, at least one of these two situations must be true everywhere in this world, wherever a river meets a sea, and also must hold for all times. There is no room for any exception. Now, I don't want to be too rude, but expecting a complete land partition to be present everywhere a river meets the sea is a bit too much to ask for, and I believe even fishes know that. This is the Thames River in England meeting the North Sea, and there is no sign of any land barrier. The region where a river meets the sea is known as an estuary. Therefore, if and only if all estuaries in the world have a non-mixing interface, Surah 25:53 would be indeed true. Now, according to marine science, there are three broad classes of estuaries observed in nature depending on the extent of mixing between the fresh river water and the salty seawater. Links for all classes of estuaries from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or in short NOAA's website, are given in the description. The first one is highly stratified estuaries, where the mixing between the river and the sea is low. The diffused interface between the river and the sea is known as the pycnocline or the halocline. Since this type of estuary is closer to the Quranic narrative, Muslim apologists will make sure to give you an impression that this is the only type of estuary that exists in nature, and that all estuaries have a sharp pycnocline. Moreover, to make their point, they would claim that the pycnocline acts as a barrier. In fact, I do agree with Muslim apologists on the last point. The sharp pycnocline does act as a transport barrier. But wait a second. Quran tells us that the barrier also needs to be a partition that is forbidden to be passed. Since the pycnocline does allow exchange of water masses, it cannot be a forbidden partition or inviolable obstruction. Here are some research articles in top journals about mixing in highly stratified or salt wedge type estuaries. I can literally go on, but I believe I made my point. Feel free to Google these articles and convince yourself. Now, according to Surah 25:53, the interface between fresh and salt water must behave exactly like the interface between oil and water. Unfortunately, they don't. Oil and water don't mix, but fresh and salt water do. That's why you see a very sharp interface between oil and water, but a diffused interface between fresh and salt water. I have added the links to these videos in the description if you are interested. Hence, even the best case scenario disagrees with Surah 25:53. The second category of estuaries is known as partially mixed estuaries, and as the name suggests, there is a moderate amount of mixing between river and the sea water. There is no sign of a barrier of any sort, forget forbidden partition. The third and the final class of estuaries is known as well-mixed estuaries, and again, as the name suggests, there is a high amount of mixing between the river water and the sea water. Again, a pycnocline or a barrier of any sort simply does not exist. Muslim apologists will never show you partially mixed estuaries and well mixed estuaries. They would pretend as if these estuaries simply don't exist. In fact, by definition, an estuary is the region where fresh and salt water mix. So, no matter what Zakir Naik tells you, this is the definition from one of the most authentic sources, which is NOAA. To learn about estuaries in detail, I would highly recommend reading this book, specifically chapters 2 and 7. In fact, chapter 7 is all about mixing in estuaries. Now, estuaries can be quite long and can even be more than 200 kilometers in length. The salinity of the seawater is about 35 parts per million, and that of river water is 0. The saltiness or the salinity at the river mouth will be like 30. As we progress inside the river, the concentration of the seawater decreases because it mixes with the river water. For example, 50 kilometers into the river will have a salinity like 20, 100 kilometers will be like 10, and 180 kilometers will be like 5. In the beginning, I asked this question, and this is the only answer which made sense. Zakir Naik, as well as all great Islamic scholars like Ibn Kathir or Al-Jalalayn or Ibn-Abbas, had the same answer. Since the verse is so clear and detailed and has such a rigorous definition of the barrier, there is absolutely no room for any confusion whatsoever. Unfortunately, we have seen that marine science is in complete disagreement with this verse. River and sea always undergo mixing, which automatically implies that there is no forbidden partition. Because of mixing with the sea, the river water for hundreds of kilometers indeed turn a bit salty. This is known as the brackish water. In fact, the part of the river which turns brackish by mixing with the sea water is defined as an estuary. Hence, the fact that estuaries exist simply refutes this verse. Let's now grade Surah 25:53. The orange part of the verse is wrong for all kinds of estuaries, while the yellow part is wrong for partially and well-mixed estuaries. Not particularly an impressive score for the all-knowing, all-wise creator of the universe, but a very believable score for an ignorant 7th century desert dweller trying to explain the laws of nature and has no clue about the existence of estuaries. Ignorance often leads to overconfidence, and because of this overconfidence, Muhammad ended up shooting himself in the foot. Wait, it gets even worse. Allah, with His infinite wisdom, only knew about two kinds of flowing water and thought that there is a forbidden partition between these two. Hence, He never accounted for the third type of flowing water, the brackish estuarine water, which, being a mixture of seawater and fresh water, is neither as salty and bitter as the seawater nor as fresh as the river water. Now, this leads us to a very important question. Muslims claim that the Quran comes from the all-knowing Allah, and therefore has no mistakes at all. This means that one mistake, just one mistake, is enough to completely destroy Quran's so-called divine origin claims. Allah got nearly everything wrong in Surah 25:53. Forbidden partition doesn't exist between the river and the sea.